The lake had been there long before the neighborhood learned how to pronounce its own name. Long before banners, welcome signs, matching mailboxes, and laminated rules appeared at the entrance. Water doesn't care about committees or boards or monthly dues, and that lake had always behaved like it knew it. It sat wide and calm behind my property, reflecting the sky without asking permission, touching land that had been surveyed, recorded, and acknowledged decades before the first HOA brochure ever hit a printer. I had grown used to the quiet authority of that fact. Ownership, real ownership, had a weight to it. It didn't announce itself. It didn't argue. It simply existed. That sense of permanence was why I never expected the problem to begin the way it did, softly, politely, and pretending to be temporary. It started with signs. Small ones at first. Bright, cheerful signs posted near the narrow gravel access road that curved down toward the water. They spoke in friendly language about community enjoyment and shared amenities. They didn't mention me. They didn't mention my deed. They didn't mention the access easement that very clearly ran through my land and ended exactly where the water began. The signs behaved as if that history had never happened, as if a paragraph could be erased simply by refusing to acknowledge it. I noticed them on a quiet afternoon, standing near my fence line like they belonged there. That was the first time I felt the faint pressure of something pushing against the truth, testing whether it would push back. I removed the signs without ceremony. No anger, no note, no confrontation. I stacked them neatly and placed them beside the road where they would be impossible to miss. That should have been the end of it. It never is. The next sign of trouble came not from objects, but from people. Cars began to appear where they never had before, families unloading coolers. Paddleboards stacked against trees, children running where livestock once grazed. The lake didn't change, but the energy around it did. The quiet respect that had once governed that space dissolved into entitlement, and entitlement has a sound. It's loud without being confident, familiar without permission. I watched from a distance at first, trying to understand whether this was ignorance or strategy. The answer became clearer when temporary fencing appeared overnight, not on my land, but just close enough to imply authority. It funneled foot traffic toward the water while subtly discouraging access from my side, like a suggestion pretending to be infrastructure. That was when I received the first letter. It arrived in a clean envelope with a return address that carried the HOA's name in bold, professional font. The language inside was careful, almost rehearsed. It spoke of misunderstandings, of community growth, of updated access plans. It referenced meetings I had never attended and decisions I had never agreed to. The lake, according to them, had become a shared resource. My access road, according to them, was now considered community passage. There was no accusation, no threat, just an assumption written as if it had already been accepted by everyone who mattered. I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. There was something almost impressive about the confidence it took to claim water that had never belonged to them. I responded the same way I always had when faced with paperwork that confused volume for authority. I said nothing. Silence, when backed by documentation, can be unsettling to people who rely on momentum. For a short while, it worked. The activity slowed. The signs disappeared. The lake settled back into its familiar rhythm. I allowed myself to believe that the message had landed, that whoever had drafted the letter had taken the time to look at a map, to read a record, to understand that some lines could not be redrawn simply because they were inconvenient. That belief lasted until the flyers appeared. They were colorful, glossy, and optimistic. They announced a summer lakeside festival, complete with music, food vendors, inflatable attractions, and a schedule that stretched from morning to sunset. The location was listed plainly. The lake, no qualifiers, no footnotes, no mention of private access. The flyer was distributed widely. It appeared on windshields, mailboxes, and social media feeds. It treated the lake as a backdrop, a stage, a public promise. I stood at the edge of my property and watched as survey stakes were hammered into the ground, marking out zones for tents and equipment. None of them crossed my fence, but all of them relied on access that did. That was the moment the situation stopped being about misunderstanding. It became about strategy. Someone had decided that if they moved fast enough, loudly enough, the facts would become irrelevant. That if they filled the space with people and noise and expectation, resistance would look unreasonable. I recognized the pattern immediately. It wasn't the first time I'd seen authority try to overwrite reality by sheer presence. The difference here was that they had chosen the wrong variable to ignore. They had focused on land and forgotten about water. Lakes are governed differently. They answer to layers of regulation that don't care about neighborhood plans or festival schedules. Water levels, drainage rights, environmental impact, all of it lives in offices far removed from HOA boardrooms. That knowledge sat quietly in my mind as the preparations continued. I didn't interfere. I didn't protest. I didn't send letters or attend meetings. I watched. And while they planned stages and food trucks, I planned something else. I pulled my deed. I pulled the original surveys. I pulled the permits tied to the lake's outflow system, the one installed decades ago to manage seasonal flooding. It was still active, still legal, still mine to control within defined limits. The realization didn't feel like revenge. It felt like alignment. Like the world reminding me that there are systems larger than social pressure, systems that operate on record and process rather than volume. I scheduled a meeting with the appropriate authority, presented the documentation, and asked a simple question about temporary water management adjustments. The answer came back clear and unambiguous. With proper notice and adherence to environmental guidelines, a temporary drawdown was permissible. A weekend for maintenance purposes. No damage. No violation, perfectly legal. I filed the paperwork, I paid the fees, I followed every rule, and then I waited. The festival countdown continued. The HOA's confidence grew. Announcements became more excited, more detailed. Volunteers were recruited, equipment was booked. Expectations were set. From the outside, it looked like they had won simply by acting as if they had. From where I stood, it looked like a structure built on the assumption that nothing beneath it would move. The lake remained calm, reflecting the sky as it always had, giving no hint of the shift that was coming. On the eve of the event, I walked down the access road alone. The air was still. The waterline sat exactly where it always had, touching the land with quiet certainty. I placed a hand on the control mechanism that had been installed long before any of us were born, a reminder that even something as vast as a lake can change when the right lever is pulled. I didn't touch it yet. Timing matters. Momentum matters. Letting people believe in a reality before it dissolves has a power of its own. As I turned back toward my house, the sounds of preparation echoed behind me. Laughter, engines, music tests. The celebration was ready. They just didn't know what kind of weekend they were actually about to have. The night settled in, heavy with expectation, and the lake held its breath. The story, which had begun with a sign and a letter, was finally ready to reveal what happens when assumption meets law. The next chapter would begin not with an argument, but with a change so quiet that it would take hours before anyone realized what was missing. The morning arrived without drama, which was exactly what made it perfect for what was about to happen, because nothing unsettles entitlement more than silence doing the work it was never prepared to hear. Before sunrise, while the neighborhood still slept beneath the illusion of certainty, the lake began to change in a way that no flyer, meeting agenda, or cheerful announcement had accounted for. There was no sudden rush, no roaring release, no cinematic collapse of water rushing away. Instead, it was gradual, methodical, obedient to physics and regulation alike, the kind of change that only becomes alarming once it's too late to stop. The controlled drawdown began exactly as permitted, the outflow system doing what it had always been designed to do, lowering the water level inch by inch, hour by hour, not out of spite or rebellion but compliance, the purest form of authority there is. By the time the first volunteers arrived to finish decorating the lakeside, the shoreline had already retreated enough to look unfamiliar, enough to introduce hesitation into movements that had been confident the night before. What had once been a welcoming edge of blue now revealed bands of darkened earth, stones that had not seen daylight in years, reeds bending awkwardly as if surprised by their own exposure. The lake was still there, unmistakably so, but its posture had changed, and with it the assumptions people brought with them. I observed from a distance, unseen and unbothered, as confusion flickered across faces that had expected certainty. Equipment carts paused, footsteps slowed, conversations lost their rhythm. At first, the response was denial, the natural instinct of anyone whose authority rests on expectation rather than fact. People assumed it was temporary, that the water would rise again before anyone important noticed, that nature was simply being inconvenient for a moment. The planners pressed forward, adjusting layouts, moving tents closer to where the water had been rather than where it now sat, treating the shifting shoreline as if it were a stubborn detail rather than the central reality. As the sun climbed higher, the retreat became impossible to ignore. The lake didn't vanish. It revealed itself differently, exposing the muddy gradient beneath the illusion of permanence, and with every inch it receded, it took another layer of confidence with it. Trucks delivering attractions hesitated, unsure where to park. Vendors questioned whether their setups would still draw crowds without the promised water backdrop. Parents arriving early with children slowed their steps, scanning the unfamiliar terrain for reassurance that never came. What had been marketed as a vibrant lakeside celebration now looked like an event stranded beside something unfinished, something pulled back before it was ready. I knew this phase well, The moment when people sense that control is slipping but haven't yet identified who is holding it. That uncertainty breeds irritation, and irritation demands direction. The HOA representatives arrived mid-morning, crisp shirts and rehearsed smiles intact, ready to oversee what they still believed was a minor complication. They walked the perimeter with forced optimism, gesturing broadly, speaking quickly, offering explanations that sounded more like wishes than plans. But optimism, when unsupported, ages fast. By late morning, the shoreline had retreated far enough to expose the truth they had carefully avoided acknowledging. The lake was not theirs to promise. The access points they had advertised now ended in soft, unstable ground. The floating dock sat awkwardly angled, no longer touching water at one end, its purpose compromised by a reality no one had prepared for. Children who had expected to run straight into shallow water instead stood at the edge of mud, their excitement replaced with confusion that parents struggled to soothe. The event had not yet officially begun, but its momentum was already unraveling. I remained absent, deliberately so, allowing the situation to speak for itself, because explanations are unnecessary when outcomes are self-evident. As the hours passed, the drawdown reached the level outlined in the permit, revealing the lake's true boundaries, the contours that had been hidden beneath assumption. The water now sat well below the makeshift staging areas, far enough that no reasonable person could pretend this was still the event they had advertised. Whispers began to circulate, not of weather or bad luck, but of permission, of authority, of whether this had been allowed at all. Those whispers are dangerous to organizations built on perceived consensus, because they invite questions, and questions require answers that cannot be improvised. The first official concern surfaced when a safety volunteer flagged the exposed ground as unstable, citing risk where families were expected to gather. That single acknowledgement cracked the facade. Once safety enters the conversation, liability follows closely behind, and liability is immune to confidence. The HOA representatives huddled, their earlier smiles replaced by tight expressions that betrayed calculation rather than leadership. Phones appeared. Calls were made. Explanations were demanded. Meanwhile, attendees continued to arrive, drawn by promises that no longer matched the scene before them. Some stayed, lingering out of curiosity. Others turned away immediately, disappointment hardening into frustration as they realized they had been sold an image rather than a plan. By early afternoon, the lake had settled into its temporary state, calm and unbothered by the commotion along its altered edge. It reflected the sky just as beautifully as it had before, perhaps more so now that the noise around it felt misplaced. The irony wasn't lost on me. The water itself was unchanged in essence, only in level, yet that minor adjustment had stripped an entire event of its foundation. The HOA's authority, which had seemed so absolute when printed on flyers, now looked flimsy against the quiet compliance of regulated infrastructure. I could see the shift happening in real time as representatives moved from denial to damage control, no longer discussing how to proceed, but how to explain. Explanations, however, are meaningless when the public can see the evidence with their own eyes. A lake that no longer touches the shore promised in bold print does not require interpretation. The turning point came when the inflatable attractions were deemed unusable due to insufficient water depth, a detail that had been central to the event's appeal. That decision rippled outward, triggering cancellations, refunds, and the slow dismantling of plans that had been presented as inevitable just days earlier. Music that had been tested earlier now felt intrusive rather than celebratory, and it was soon silenced altogether. The crowd thinned. The energy collapsed inward, leaving behind the uncomfortable quiet of something that had failed publicly. Throughout it all, no one came looking for me, not yet. They were too busy grappling with the reality that the problem wasn't logistical, it was foundational. They had built an event on access they did not control, on water they did not own, and on an assumption that no one would challenge them in a way that mattered. As the afternoon wore on and the sun dipped lower, the HOA faced the unavoidable decision to cancel what remained of the festival, a move that was framed as temporary but felt final to everyone watching. Announcements were made, carefully worded to avoid blame, but blame hung in the air regardless, heavy and unresolved. Equipment was packed up, vendors left early, families departed with a kind of disappointment that doesn't fade quickly because it wasn't caused by weather or chance but by misrepresentation. The lake, now quiet again, seemed to reclaim its space, indifferent to the plans that had attempted to define it. I watched as the shoreline, newly revealed, became the most honest participant in the day, exposing what happens when authority ignores documentation. The drawdown had been executed perfectly, legally, and without confrontation, yet its impact was undeniable. The HOA's celebration had dissolved not because of protest or conflict, but because reality had been allowed to reassert itself. As evening settled in and the last vehicles pulled away, the area returned to a version of quiet that felt heavier than before, charged with unresolved tension. The lake rested in its temporary state, patient and unbothered, knowing it would rise again soon, unchanged in the ways that mattered. The neighborhood, however, would not recover so easily. Questions had been planted, expectations had been broken, authority had been exposed, and somewhere behind closed doors, people were beginning to realize that this wasn't a random inconvenience but a deliberate, lawful reminder that control is not something you can declare. The chapter closed not with confrontation, but with absence, the absence of water where it had been promised, and the absence of certainty where it had once been assumed, setting the stage for reactions that would be far louder than anything the lake itself had done. The aftermath settled in slower than the water had drained, seeping into the neighborhood with a quiet persistence that made it impossible to ignore, because embarrassment has a way of lingering far longer than celebration ever does. By the following morning, the lake remained calm in its reduced state, unchanged and unapologetic, while the community around it buzzed with speculation, revision, and the kind of selective memory that often follows public failure. Social media posts that had once promoted the festival with bright optimism quietly vanished or were edited beyond recognition, their captions softened into vague references to unexpected circumstances and last-minute complications. The absence of accountability was immediate and predictable, yet beneath that surface-level retreat, something more frantic was unfolding. Authority, when publicly exposed, does not dissolve peacefully. It searches for a place to land, and more often than not, that place is a single individual who can be framed as the problem. I could feel that shift even before it reached me directly, the subtle tightening of narrative that happens when organizations decide the truth is inconvenient. Committees met behind closed doors, not to review facts, but to recalibrate messaging. The lake's drawdown, perfectly documented and lawfully executed, began to be described in internal communications as unexpected interference, a phrase that deliberately avoided the word legal. The access road I owned was suddenly referred to as contested, despite decades of records proving otherwise. Language, when wielded carefully, can make solid ground feel uncertain, and that was precisely the strategy unfolding. I remained silent, watching the process with the patience of someone who understands that premature defense often strengthens a weak accusation. The first formal response came in the form of an email distributed to residents, framed as an update rather than an explanation. It spoke broadly about external actions that had impacted the event and assured readers that the HOA was investigating all options to prevent similar disruptions in the future. There was no name mentioned, but the implication was clear enough for anyone paying attention. It was an invitation for speculation, and speculation arrived eagerly, filling the gaps left by the HOA's careful omissions. I noticed the change almost immediately in the way people looked toward my property, curiosity sharpening into suspicion as a narrative quietly assembled itself without evidence. That is the danger of authority left unchecked. It doesn't need proof to influence perception, only repetition. Within days, the HOA escalated from implication to action, issuing notices that questioned the legality of the drawdown despite having no jurisdiction to do so. These notices were not sent to me directly at first. Instead, they were circulated among residents, framed as concerns raised on behalf of the community. It was a calculated move, designed to apply pressure indirectly to make me appear isolated before any confrontation occurred. The language grew more assertive with each iteration, referencing potential violations, environmental impact, and community disruption, all while conveniently ignoring the permits and compliance reports that had governed the entire process. I could see the shape of the accusation forming, hollow but loud, ready to be deployed the moment someone decided it was time to confront the source of their embarrassment. The turning point came when a board member, emboldened by internal consensus rather than legal standing, filed a formal complaint with a county office that had already approved the drawdown. It was a gamble rooted in the belief that volume could outweigh documentation, that enough noise might create hesitation even where clarity existed. The response from the county was swift and decisive, not in my favor specifically, but in favor of process itself. The complaint was acknowledged, reviewed, and closed with a confirmation that all actions taken were within permitted limits. That confirmation, however, was not shared publicly by the HOA. Instead, it was quietly absorbed and reinterpreted internally as a temporary ruling, a phrase that kept hope alive for those unwilling to accept finality. This refusal to accept reality marked a shift from confusion to hostility. Where earlier reactions had been marked by embarrassment, now there was resentment, the kind that seeks retribution rather than resolution. The HOA began to explore ways to reclaim control, not over the lake itself, but over the narrative surrounding it. Discussions emerged about restricting access, reevaluating easements, and revisiting historical agreements, all framed as routine governance despite being anything but. I became aware of these conversations through the subtle changes in enforcement elsewhere in the neighborhood, a sudden increase in scrutiny that felt less like coincidence and more like retaliation. The message was clear. If the lake could not be controlled, pressure would be applied wherever it could stick. Throughout this period, I continued to do nothing publicly, a choice that unsettled those accustomed to escalation. Silence, when paired with documentation, creates a vacuum that forces others to reveal their intentions. And reveal them they did. The HOA's next move was to announce a special meeting dedicated to community water access concerns, a title broad enough to sound inclusive while targeting a single issue. Attendance was encouraged, urgency emphasized, and expectations quietly inflated. This meeting was not about problem solving, it was about reasserting dominance in a space where it had been visibly undermined. The preparation alone spoke volumes, with talking points distributed internally that framed the drawdown as an act of disruption rather than maintenance, carefully omitting the legal foundation beneath it. I chose not to attend. My absence was interpreted exactly as intended, fueling speculation and reinforcing the narrative of obstruction they were trying to build. Meanwhile, the lake remained unchanged, its reduced level serving as a constant reminder that authority does not flow upward simply because it demands to. Residents walked the shoreline with new eyes, noticing markers and boundaries they had never questioned before, quietly absorbing the lesson that not everything labeled communal actually is. This subtle shift in awareness threatened the HOA more than any single action I had taken, because it undermined the assumption of omnipresence that such organizations rely on. Control, once questioned, becomes difficult to restore. As days passed, frustration within the HOA began to leak outward, manifesting in increasingly aggressive communications that contradicted one another in tone and substance. One notice emphasized collaboration, while the next hinted at enforcement. The inconsistency revealed a group struggling to reconcile its image with its limitations. Behind the scenes, legal consultations were sought, not to challenge the permits, but to find leverage elsewhere, any foothold that might restore balance in their favor. Those efforts, however, were constrained by the same records they had ignored initially. Every path circled back to the same conclusion. The lake access they had advertised was never theirs to guarantee. This realization did not bring acceptance, only desperation. Authority, when cornered, often doubles down, mistaking persistence for strength. The HOA's final attempt to shift blame came in the form of a community-wide survey, framed as a way to gather input, but structured to guide responses toward a predetermined conclusion. Questions were worded to imply wrongdoing without stating it outright, asking residents how they felt about unilateral actions and unexpected disruptions. It was an exercise in perception management, not governance. Yet even this effort faltered as residents began to recognize the pattern, connecting the dots between the festival's failure and the HOA's unwillingness to acknowledge its own overreach. The lake, in its quiet compliance with regulation, had become a mirror reflecting more than water levels. It reflected the limits of assumed authority. By the end of the week, the narrative the HOA had hoped to control began slipping beyond its grasp, reshaped by facts that refused to stay buried. I watched as conversations shifted from blame to curiosity, from frustration to understanding, the community slowly realizing that the story they had been told was incomplete. This was not the end of the conflict, not even close, but it marked a critical transition. The HOA had revealed its hand, exposing not just a misunderstanding of property rights, but a deeper discomfort with boundaries it could not redraw. As the lake waited patiently for its level to rise again, the neighborhood braced for what would come next, because authority that fails quietly rarely retreats quietly. The next chapter would not be about water or permits, but about escalation, about what happens when those who mistake control for ownership decide that silence is no longer acceptable. By the time the lake began its slow, permitted return to normal levels, the neighborhood had already crossed a threshold that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with pride. Because once authority feels exposed, it rarely seeks balance. It seeks restoration, and restoration almost always arrives disguised as enforcement. The HOA's posture shifted noticeably in the days that followed, not through any single dramatic action, but through a tightening of tone that spread across notices, emails, and casual interactions like an atmospheric change you can feel before a storm. What had once been framed as a community inconvenience was now quietly recast as a challenge to order itself, and that distinction mattered because inconvenience can be forgiven, but challenges invite response. Enforcement vehicles began appearing more frequently along roads they had rarely patrolled before. Rules that had sat dormant for years were suddenly rediscovered and applied with renewed enthusiasm, as if the mere act of noticing them might restore credibility. The timing was not subtle, nor was it accidental. Each citation, each warning, each carefully worded reminder carried the same unspoken message. Authority may have stumbled, but it had not relinquished its appetite. I observed the pattern without reacting, understanding that escalation feeds on resistance as much as compliance, and that the true test of control lies in how loudly it demands acknowledgement. Residents began to notice as well, the shift too coordinated to ignore, the increase in scrutiny too sudden to be coincidence. Conversations that once revolved around weekend plans now included speculation about motives, about whether the HOA was attempting to compensate for the festival's collapse by reasserting itself wherever possible. This growing awareness unsettled the board more than outright opposition ever could, because skepticism erodes influence quietly, leaving nothing solid to confront. In response, the HOA doubled down on structure, announcing a series of reviews and assessments framed as proactive governance, but driven by a clear need to reclaim narrative ground. Committees were formed, consultants referenced, and timelines proposed, all circling the same unresolved issue without naming it directly. The lake access was never mentioned explicitly, yet it hovered over every discussion like an unresolved accusation, shaping decisions without appearing on any agenda. I received my first direct communication during this phase, a formal letter requesting documentation related to the drawdown, despite the fact that all such documentation had already been filed and approved through the appropriate channels. The request was not about information, it was about posture. By asking, the HOA could suggest that something remained unsettled, that authority still had a role to play. I responded with a copy of the permits and compliance confirmations, nothing more, nothing less, allowing the records to speak without commentary. The reply I received in return was brief and non-committal, acknowledging receipt without conceding clarity, a bureaucratic pause designed to buy time rather than resolution. That pause marked the beginning of a more aggressive phase, one where indirect pressure gave way to overt maneuvering. The HOA announced an intention to review all easements within the neighborhood, citing a need for updated records and consistency. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, even responsible, but the scope was telling, expansive enough to justify scrutiny of access routes that had never been questioned before. This move was less about accuracy than leverage, an attempt to create uncertainty where none had existed, because uncertainty is fertile ground for negotiation, and negotiation is where authority believes it thrives. Residents affected by the review expressed confusion, some irritation, others quiet concern, as familiar paths were suddenly framed as provisional. The ripple effect was immediate, trust thinning as people realized that what they had assumed to be stable could be revisited at any time if it served a larger agenda. Meanwhile, the lake continued to refill at its measured pace, indifferent to the tension unfolding around it, its surface rising steadily as if to remind everyone that processes grounded in law do not respond to emotion. This contrast between natural compliance and administrative agitation sharpened the divide between reality and perception, a divide the HOA struggled to bridge. Meetings grew longer, more frequent, and less productive, as discussions circled endlessly around the same unresolved frustration. The board's language hardened, shifting from collaborative to corrective, as if firmness alone might reassert control. Yet each attempt to tighten its grip only highlighted the limits of its reach, because the community had seen what happened when authority overstepped, and memory is a powerful counterweight to intimidation. I noticed a change in how people approached me during this period, subtle but significant. a quiet acknowledgement that something larger than a canceled festival was at play. There were no direct questions, no overt alliances, just a growing recognition that the story being told by the HOA did not align with the evidence people had witnessed themselves. This unspoken understanding unnerved the board more than open dissent ever could, because it suggested that influence was slipping in ways that could not be easily measured or corrected. In response, the HOA sought validation beyond the neighborhood, reaching out to external advisors and legal counsel in an effort to reinforce its position. These consultations, however, yielded the same conclusion repeated in different language. Without jurisdiction, authority is symbolic at best. That reality did not deter the board so much as frustrate it, because symbols lose power when exposed to scrutiny. The escalation reached a new level when the HOA attempted to introduce temporary access restrictions near the lake, citing safety concerns during the refilling process. The irony was unmistakable. The same organization that had ignored safety considerations during the festival now invoked them to justify control, a move transparent enough to provoke quiet disbelief among residents. Compliance with these restrictions was uneven, not out of defiance but confusion, as people struggled to reconcile inconsistent messaging with lived experience. The board responded with reminders and warnings, escalating tone without clarifying purpose, further eroding confidence in its leadership. Throughout it all, I maintained a deliberate distance, engaging only where necessary and always through formal channels, because escalation thrives on emotional response, and I had no intention of providing one. This restraint became its own form of pressure, forcing the HOA to confront the possibility that its tactics were not producing the desired effect. As the lake neared its normal level, the physical reminder of the board's miscalculation faded, but the psychological imprint remained, shaping interactions in ways that could not be undone. The water returned quietly, reclaiming the shoreline without fanfare, as if to underscore that the most significant changes had already occurred elsewhere. The HOA's authority, once assumed, now felt provisional, contingent on cooperation rather than compliance, a shift that unsettled those accustomed to unquestioned influence. By the end of this phase, it was clear that escalation had not restored control. It had exposed fragility. The board stood at a crossroads it had not anticipated, forced to choose between recalibration and confrontation, between acknowledging limits and pushing against them. The choice they would make next would define not just the future of lake access, but the character of governance within the neighborhood itself, because authority, once challenged, must either evolve or harden, and the signs suggested that hardening was already underway, setting the stage for a conflict no one would be able to pretend was about water alone. By the time the lake fully reclaimed its familiar shoreline, the conflict had shifted entirely from land and water to paper and perception, because when visible leverage disappears, institutions like the HOA retreat into documents, convinced that complexity itself can substitute for authority. What began as scattered notices and vague reviews hardened into a coordinated administrative push, one built not on new evidence but on the sheer volume of process. Letters multiplied. Requests overlapped. Deadlines appeared that referenced policies no one remembered approving. It was a classic maneuver, the kind designed to exhaust rather than convince, to overwhelm a single property owner with procedural noise until compliance felt easier than clarity. The assumption was simple and deeply flawed, that I would tire of reading, responding, and documenting long before they ran out of forms. What they failed to understand was that paper has memory, and memory has consequences when someone takes the time to align it properly. I began assembling my own record, not reactively, but methodically, pulling together every survey, easement, permit, correspondence, and historical reference tied to the lake and its access. Each document told the same story in different language, a story of boundaries acknowledged, rights granted, and authority clearly defined. Individually, they were unremarkable. Together, they formed a narrative that could not be rewritten without tearing holes through decades of recorded history. The HOA's next move came quietly, tucked into an innocuous-looking update that announced a comprehensive audit of community infrastructure. The word audit carries weight, suggesting neutrality and expertise, but the focus areas revealed the intent immediately. Access roads, water rights, shared use pathways, all the elements that brushed up against my property were suddenly under review. This was not governance. It was triangulation, an attempt to surround the issue without confronting it directly. I noticed how carefully the language avoided acknowledging ownership, preferring instead terms like stewardship and communal interest, as if repeating them often enough might blur the legal distinctions they were trying so hard to escape. Residents received these updates with mixed reactions. Some accepted them at face value, trusting that the HOA knew what it was doing. Others, informed by recent events, began to question why so much energy was being spent revisiting issues that had never caused problems before. That quiet questioning was more disruptive than open opposition, because it introduced doubt without offering a clear target. Doubt spreads laterally, slipping into conversations and reshaping assumptions without triggering defenses. The HOA responded by accelerating its timeline, pushing initiatives forward before skepticism could fully mature. Notices were sent requesting access for inspections. Consultants were referenced by title rather than name. Authority was implied through association rather than jurisdiction. It was all very careful, very strategic, and fundamentally hollow. When I received a request to provide additional documentation regarding the access road, I recognized it for what it was: a fishing expedition, an attempt to find an inconsistency they could magnify into leverage. I complied fully, submitting not only what was requested but contextual records that framed those documents within their broader legal history. It was a risky move from their perspective, because context is the enemy of selective interpretation. The response I received was delayed, then diluted, acknowledging receipt without comment, a clear sign that the material had not yielded the weakness they were hoping to uncover. Frustration began to bleed through the HOA's communications at this stage, subtle but unmistakable. The tone sharpened. Phrases like potential noncompliance appeared more frequently, unaccompanied by specifics. The strategy shifted from discovery to insinuation, from inquiry to implication. This was the point where many disputes turn personal, where authority seeks to provoke an emotional reaction it can then frame as unreasonable. I refused to provide one. Instead, I continued documenting everything, logging dates, preserving correspondence, noting inconsistencies. Each message from the HOA became another thread woven into a tapestry they would eventually be forced to confront. Behind the scenes, something else was happening that the board did not anticipate. Residents began requesting access to records, asking questions about the audit's scope, its cost, its necessity. Transparency, once demanded, has a way of multiplying demands for itself. The HOA, accustomed to operating without scrutiny, struggled to respond coherently. Answers varied depending on who was asked, revealing a lack of unified understanding that eroded confidence further. The more the board tried to assert control through process, the more it exposed its internal uncertainty. This tension came to a head when the HOA circulated a draft proposal suggesting changes to access policies that would, in effect, formalize control over routes they did not own. The proposal was framed as a preventative measure, a way to avoid future misunderstandings, but its implications were obvious to anyone familiar with the situation. It was an attempt to legislate authority retroactively, to transform assumption into policy without confronting the legal barriers that made such authority impossible. The response from the community was immediate and unexpectedly measured. Questions poured in, not accusatory but precise, asking how such changes aligned with existing deeds, easements, and county regulations. These were not emotional objections. They were structural ones, the kind that cannot be waved away with reassurance. The board found itself on unfamiliar ground, forced to answer questions it had hoped to avoid. I watched this unfold with a growing sense of inevitability, because once a paper trail becomes visible, it stops being a tool of control and starts becoming evidence. The HOA attempted to regain footing by convening another special meeting, this one explicitly focused on governance and compliance. The framing was defensive, the urgency palpable. They needed to demonstrate relevance, to show that they still held the reins, even as those reins slipped through their fingers. I chose not to attend, knowing that my presence would only distract from the larger dynamic now playing out. The meeting, by all accounts, was tense, marked by long explanations that answered few questions and assurances that sounded increasingly strained. The board spoke at length about responsibility and order, but avoided specifics whenever legal boundaries were raised. That avoidance did not go unnoticed. In the days that followed, the audit quietly stalled. Timelines were revised, language softened. The aggressive momentum that had characterized the previous weeks dissipated into cautious reevaluation. It became clear that the HOA had reached the limits of what process alone could accomplish. Without a factual foundation to support their claims, the weight of their own documentation began to press back against them. The lake, now fully restored, seemed almost incidental to the conflict it had revealed, a physical reminder of a challenge that had migrated into the realm of governance itself. I remained patient, understanding that this phase was not about victory but exposure. The HOA had built a narrative on assumption and attempted to reinforce it with volume, only to discover that paper, when examined, does not bend easily. Each document they produced to assert control only highlighted the absence of authority they were trying to mask. As the chapter closed, the board faced an uncomfortable truth. The more they dug, the more clearly the boundaries they had ignored came into view. The paper trail they thought would bury the issue had instead illuminated it, setting the stage for a reckoning that would require more than policy revisions and carefully worded updates. The next chapter would not be driven by paperwork or permits, but by consequences, because once a narrative collapses under its own weight, someone always has to answer for what remains. By the time the HOA realized that paperwork was no longer shielding them but exposing them, the situation had already slipped beyond their ability to manage quietly, because consequences have a way of arriving on schedules no board can vote to delay. What had once been an internal struggle to preserve authority now began manifesting in outward effects that touched the very residents the HOA claimed to protect, and that shift changed everything. The stalled audit left invoices unpaid, consultants disengaged, and explanations half-formed, creating gaps that residents noticed immediately. Because when money and clarity disappear at the same time, suspicion rushes in to fill the space. Questions about where dues were being spent grew sharper, no longer abstract concerns but pointed inquiries tied directly to the failed festival, the legal consultations, and the sudden administrative push that had produced nothing tangible. The HOA attempted to reassure the community with general statements about long-term planning and strategic oversight, but reassurance without specificity sounds hollow, especially to people who had just watched authority overreach and retreat in rapid succession. The lake, now fully restored and serene, stood in quiet contrast to the turbulence unfolding around it, a reminder that stability does not require performance. I noticed how conversations shifted from what had happened to what it had cost, both financially and reputationally, and how quickly trust, once cracked, began to fracture along invisible fault lines. Board members who had once spoken with unified confidence now offered slightly different versions of events depending on the audience, a subtle divergence that revealed internal disagreement they could no longer contain. That disagreement soon leaked into decisions, with enforcement actions slowing, then stopping altogether, as if the HOA itself were uncertain where its authority still applied. This inconsistency unsettled residents more than strict enforcement ever had, because unpredictability erodes confidence faster than rigidity. The first tangible consequence surfaced when a scheduled infrastructure project was postponed due to budget reassessment, a polite phrase that barely concealed the reality that funds had been redirected toward efforts that yielded no return. That postponement affected daily life in ways that could not be ignored, turning abstract governance failures into practical inconveniences that demanded explanation. Residents who had remained neutral until then began to pay closer attention, not out of loyalty to any side, but out of concern for outcomes that now affected them directly. The HOA responded with appeals for patience, urging the community to trust the process, but patience is difficult to sustain when the process itself appears directionless. Behind closed doors, tensions intensified as board members faced the uncomfortable realization that the conflict they had escalated could not be resolved without acknowledging mistakes they were unwilling to admit publicly. Attempts were made to reframe the situation as a learning experience, but that narrative clashed with the continued absence of accountability. Meanwhile, external scrutiny increased as county offices, responding to repeated inquiries, reaffirmed their earlier conclusions, quietly reinforcing the legitimacy of the actions taken while declining to engage in the HOA's reframing efforts. These confirmations, though not dramatic, carried weight because they removed any remaining ambiguity about jurisdiction. The board's options narrowed rapidly, yet instead of recalibrating, they hesitated, caught between the desire to maintain authority and the fear of conceding it. That hesitation proved costly. A small but telling incident underscored the shift when a routine enforcement notice was challenged by a resident citing inconsistencies revealed during the audit discussions. The challenge was polite, factual, and supported by documentation, Yet it effectively halted the action, exposing how weakened the HOA's position had become. Word spread quickly, not as gossip but as precedent, and with precedent comes expectation. Residents began to realize that compliance was no longer automatic, that rules could be questioned without immediate reprisal, and that realization altered the balance of power in ways no policy update could reverse. I remained deliberately unobtrusive during this phase, understanding that visibility would only distract from the broader implications now unfolding. The conflict had evolved beyond me, beyond the lake, into a reckoning about governance itself. The HOA's attempt to consolidate authority through escalation had instead democratized scrutiny, inviting residents to examine structures they had previously accepted without question. This was not rebellion, it was awareness, and awareness is difficult to suppress once it takes hold. As the board struggled to regain footing, resignations began to surface, framed as personal decisions but clearly tied to the mounting pressure. Each departure weakened the image of stability the HOA relied upon, forcing remaining members to shoulder responsibilities they had not anticipated. The tone of communications softened noticeably, shifting from assertive to conciliatory, as if the organization were slowly recognizing that its previous approach had failed. Yet even this shift felt reactive rather than reflective, a tactical retreat rather than genuine recalibration. The community sensed the difference, responding with cautious engagement rather than renewed trust. Amid this turbulence, the lake continued its quiet existence, unchanged and unbothered, a symbol of boundaries respected by law if not by ego. Its presence underscored the lesson the HOA seemed slow to absorb. Authority grounded in assumption collapses under scrutiny, while authority grounded in process endures without noise. By the end of this chapter, the consequences of overreach had become impossible to ignore, no longer confined to embarrassment or administrative inconvenience, but woven into the daily operations and credibility of the HOA itself. The board stood diminished, its influence fractured, its narrative unraveled by the very processes it had attempted to weaponize. What began as an effort to seize control over access had cascaded into a broader loss of control over governance, leaving the HOA at a crossroads it could no longer avoid. The next chapter would not be about reaction or damage control, but about decision, because once consequences surface, someone must choose whether to confront them honestly or continue pretending they can be deferred, and that choice would determine not just the fate of the lake, but the future of authority within the community. The decision, when it finally came, did not arrive with the clarity or courage that moments like these demand, but with hesitation layered over compromise, because the HOA had reached a point where every available option carried consequences they no longer felt equipped to manage. Authority, once fractured, does not reassemble easily, and the board's attempts to move forward revealed just how deeply the earlier overreach had altered the balance within the community. Meetings became shorter, less decisive, stripped of the declarative tone that had once defined them. Language softened not out of humility, but uncertainty, as if each statement were being tested for how much resistance it might provoke rather than how accurately it reflected reality. The lake, still calm and ordinary in appearance, remained the silent axis around which all of this rotated, a reminder that the most destabilizing challenges are often the ones that expose rather than attack. Residents sensed the shift immediately, even those who had remained disengaged until now, because when an institution loses confidence in its own voice, the absence resonates louder than any announcement. Participation in HOA activities declined not dramatically but steadily, a quiet withdrawal that signaled disengagement rather than rebellion. People stopped volunteering for committees, stopped attending optional meetings, stopped treating directives as default expectations. This erosion of participation unsettled the remaining board members more than open opposition ever could, because it suggested that authority was no longer compelling enough to command attention. In response, the HOA attempted to recalibrate by introducing a series of listening initiatives, framed as opportunities for feedback and collaboration. On paper, they appeared progressive, even generous, but the execution betrayed their underlying motive: control through containment. Feedback was solicited, but tightly structured, filtered through predetermined categories that steered responses away from fundamental questions about jurisdiction and accountability. Still, even within those constraints, patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Residents expressed fatigue, frustration, and a growing sense that the HOA's priorities no longer aligned with the community's needs. The lake incident was referenced indirectly, often as a turning point, not because of the inconvenience it caused, but because of what it revealed about decision-making without consent. These sentiments, once voiced, altered the conversation permanently because they shifted the focus from isolated events to systemic behavior. The board struggled to respond, caught between acknowledging criticism and defending legacy decisions, and in that struggle their influence waned further. I observed this evolution with a sense of inevitability, aware that the conflict had long since moved beyond anything I could resolve alone. The lake had simply acted as a catalyst, accelerating a process that might otherwise have taken years to surface. My role, now largely invisible, underscored the paradox at the heart of the situation. The less I engaged, the more clearly the HOA's limitations revealed themselves. This absence frustrated some board members who had hoped for a visible adversary to rally against, someone they could frame as unreasonable or obstructive. Without that figure, they were forced to confront the possibility that the problem was structural rather than personal. That realization did not come easily. Attempts were made to redirect attention toward future projects, new amenities, and revised community goals, all designed to restore momentum and distract from unresolved issues. Yet each proposal was met with cautious scrutiny rather than enthusiasm, as residents weighed promises against recent experience. Trust, once shaken, demands proof rather than persuasion, and proof was in short supply. The HOA's budget constraints further complicated these efforts, limiting the scope of new initiatives and reinforcing perceptions of mismanagement. Conversations about dues adjustments surfaced, immediately sparking concern and resistance, because few were willing to pay more into a system whose authority they now questioned. This financial pressure compounded the board's challenges, forcing difficult discussions about priorities and sustainability that could no longer be deferred. Internal divisions deepened as members disagreed over how to proceed, some advocating for transparency and acknowledgement, others clinging to the belief that time alone would heal the rift. These disagreements, once contained, began to surface in subtle ways, through conflicting statements and uneven enforcement that signaled a lack of cohesion. Residents noticed, and their reactions reflected a growing confidence in questioning decisions rather than accepting them by default. This shift, though gradual, was profound, because it marked a transition from passive compliance to active engagement, a change that reshaped the community's relationship with governance itself. The lake, unchanged and steady, became a symbol in conversations, referenced not as a grievance but as a lesson, an example of what happens when authority overreaches without understanding its boundaries. I found it striking how often the discussion returned to process rather than outcome, to the importance of consultation, clarity, and respect for established rights. These were not radical demands, but they felt radical in a context where such principles had been taken for granted. As the weeks passed, the HOA's attempts to regain momentum grew increasingly cautious, each step weighed against the risk of further backlash. This caution, while understandable, further eroded the perception of leadership, reinforcing the sense that the board was reacting rather than guiding. The community adjusted accordingly, filling gaps with informal networks of communication and cooperation that bypassed official channels. This organic reorganization did not dismantle the HOA, but it diminished its centrality, reducing it to one voice among many rather than the definitive authority it once claimed to be. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the shift could not be reversed, because it was not the result of a single decision but a cumulative awakening. The lake had returned to its normal level, the festival was a distant memory, and yet the consequences continued to ripple outward, reshaping expectations and redefining power. The HOA stood at a diminished crossroads, its authority no longer assumed but contingent, its future dependent on choices it had delayed too long. The next chapter would confront those choices directly, because when systems lose legitimacy, they must either transform in meaningful ways or accept their reduced role, and the path forward would demand more than careful wording and strategic silence. By the time the HOA understood that the shift in power was no longer theoretical but operational, the reckoning had already embedded itself into the routine of everyday life, arriving without spectacle, without speeches, and without the kind of drama that organizations expect when they believe they are under attack. It showed up instead in minutes that ran shorter than planned because fewer people spoke, in agenda items that were tabled because no one wanted to champion them, and in decisions that defaulted to delay because delay felt safer than assertion. The lake, steady and unremarkable in its restored fullness, no longer commanded attention on its own, yet it lingered in the background of every conversation like a benchmark against which all claims of authority were silently measured. The HOA attempted one final reframing, a comprehensive communication that acknowledged missteps in communication while carefully avoiding acknowledgement of overreach, hoping that contrition without specificity might satisfy enough people to stabilize the organization. The response was muted, not hostile, but tellingly reserved, because the community had learned to read between the lines and recognize the difference between apology and accountability. Residents were no longer interested in tone. They wanted alignment between words and structure. That desire manifested in practical ways, beginning with requests for clearer boundaries, written confirmations, and documented limitations on authority, requests that would have seemed unnecessary months earlier but now felt essential. The HOA, faced with these demands, found itself constrained by its own history of ambiguity, struggling to provide clarity where it had long relied on assumption. Efforts to streamline governance revealed layers of inconsistency, policies that contradicted one another, and precedents that had been applied selectively depending on convenience. Each discovery reinforced the perception that authority had been exercised expansively without sufficient grounding, and that realization carried weight even among those who still supported the HOA's existence. The reckoning deepened as external advisors, brought in to restore confidence, delivered assessments that echoed what residents already sensed. The organization's challenges were structural, not situational. These assessments, though intended to guide improvement, instead underscored the gap between the HOA's self-image and its operational reality, a gap widened by years of unchecked discretion. The board grappled with these findings, torn between the impulse to defend legacy practices and the necessity of reform, a tension that slowed progress and intensified scrutiny. Meanwhile, informal leadership emerged within the community, not as a coordinated movement, but as a series of practical responses to unmet needs, neighbors organizing solutions without waiting for approval. This quiet competence contrasted sharply with the HOA's paralysis, highlighting the difference between authority that commands and leadership that responds. I watched this unfold with a sense of distance, aware that my involvement had long since ceased to be central, yet conscious that the catalyst remained unresolved in the collective memory. The lake, once contested, had become a reference point, not because of what had happened there, but because of what it had revealed about the limits of imposed control. Discussions about future projects inevitably returned to the question of consent, of whether initiatives should proceed simply because they could or only because they were agreed upon. This recalibration altered the tone of governance permanently, replacing assumption with deliberation. The HOA's attempt to reassert relevance through new initiatives faltered as residents evaluated proposals through a newly critical lens, asking not just what was planned, but why and under whose authority. Funding approvals slowed. Volunteer participation remained low. The board's appeals for unity rang hollow against the backdrop of unresolved accountability. Even those sympathetic to the HOA's challenges acknowledged that trust, once fractured, required more than patience to repair. The reckoning reached its quiet apex when a routine vote failed to pass due to insufficient participation, a procedural outcome that symbolized the broader disengagement now shaping the organization's reality. This was not rebellion, it was indifference, the most difficult obstacle for authority to overcome. The HOA, confronted with this indifference, began to confront the possibility that its role would need to change fundamentally to remain relevant. Conversations shifted toward restructuring, redefining scope, and codifying limitations, discussions that would have seemed radical not long ago, but now felt inevitable. The lake, indifferent to these deliberations, reflected the sky with the same quiet assurance it always had, a reminder that stability does not depend on recognition. As the chapter drew to a close, it was clear that the reckoning had not produced winners or losers in the conventional sense, but it had produced clarity, and clarity carries its own weight. The HOA stood diminished but not destroyed, challenged but not irrelevant, poised at the edge of transformation it could no longer avoid. The community, having witnessed the consequences of unchecked authority, moved forward with a recalibrated sense of agency, less willing to defer, more willing to engage. The next chapter would determine whether this reckoning would lead to renewal or retreat, because when institutions are stripped of illusion, what remains must either be rebuilt on firmer ground or accepted for what it truly is. The moment the HOA finally recognized that avoidance had become more damaging than admission arrived not with confrontation, but with fatigue, the kind that settles in when every meeting feels heavier than the last and every decision carries the echo of something left unresolved. Authority can survive criticism, even failure, but it struggles to endure exhaustion, especially when that exhaustion is shared by those expected to uphold it. By now, the community had adjusted to a new rhythm, one in which the HOA existed more as a reference point than a directive force, its presence acknowledged but no longer central. This adjustment forced the board into an uncomfortable clarity. If it continued to operate as it always had, it would become irrelevant not through opposition, but through quiet neglect. That realization reframed the conflict entirely, shifting the focus from defending past actions to deciding whether the organization itself would evolve or simply persist in diminished form. The lake, unchanged and unremarkable in its daily stillness, hovered at the edge of these deliberations, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what happens when systems overextend themselves. The board's internal discussions grew more candid, less guarded, as members confronted the limits of their influence and the consequences of their earlier choices. Some argued for decisive reform, acknowledging missteps and proposing clear boundaries that would redefine the HOA's scope. Others resisted, fearing that such acknowledgement would undermine whatever authority remained, clinging to the belief that time and consistency could restore trust without concession. This divide mirrored a larger tension between legacy and legitimacy, between preserving form and rebuilding function. As these debates unfolded, the community watched with a detachment born of experience, no longer invested in rhetoric but attentive to outcomes. Proposals were circulated outlining potential changes to governance, including clearer definitions of jurisdiction, mandatory consultation for initiatives affecting private rights, and mechanisms for accountability that had previously existed only in theory. These proposals were met with cautious interest rather than enthusiasm, because residents had learned to reserve judgment until actions followed words. The board, aware of this skepticism, faced pressure to demonstrate sincerity, not through promises but through decisions that carried real consequence. The turning point came when a long-standing policy, one that had enabled expansive interpretation of authority, was formally reconsidered. This policy, rarely questioned in the past, had underpinned many of the HOA's actions, including those that led to the lake conflict. Revisiting it required the board to confront the root of the issue rather than its symptoms, a step that felt both necessary and threatening. Discussions stretched late into evenings, marked by tension and hesitation, as members weighed the risks of change against the certainty of continued erosion. Outside the boardroom, residents engaged in their own quiet assessments, discussing what kind of governance they wanted, if any, and how much authority they were willing to cede moving forward. These conversations, once hypothetical, now carried urgency, because the outcome would shape not just policy but culture. I remained on the periphery, observing how the conflict had matured into something broader and more consequential than any single decision, aware that my silence continued to serve as a mirror reflecting the organization's choices back to itself. When the board finally convened for what was framed as a decisive session, the atmosphere was subdued rather than charged, the absence of spectacle underscoring the gravity of what was at stake. The discussion centered not on the lake, but on governance principles, on whether authority should be proactive or reactive, expansive or restrained. For the first time, the language used acknowledged limits explicitly, a subtle but significant shift that suggested the board understood the nature of the crossroads it faced. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it was clear enough to signal direction, a commitment to restructure, to codify boundaries, and to accept a reduced but more legitimate role within the community. This decision did not erase past missteps, nor did it immediately restore trust, but it marked a departure from denial toward accountability. The community's response was measured, not celebratory, reflecting a collective understanding that meaningful change unfolds slowly and requires sustained effort. The lake, once again, served as a quiet counterpoint, its calm surface indifferent to the deliberations it had inspired, yet emblematic of the stability that comes from respecting natural limits. In the days that followed, the HOA began implementing its chosen path, revising policies, clarifying authority, and opening processes to greater scrutiny. These actions, though incremental, signaled a willingness to align governance with reality rather than assumption. Residents responded with cautious engagement, participating where invited but maintaining a watchful distance, mindful of how easily trust can be misplaced. As this chapter drew to a close, it was evident that the choice made could not undo the past, but it could shape the future, determining whether the HOA would adapt to its diminished authority or continue to struggle against it. The conflict, which had begun with an attempt to seize control over something never owned, had evolved into a broader lesson about the nature of power and the cost of ignoring boundaries. The final chapter would reveal whether this lesson would be fully absorbed or merely acknowledged, because true resolution is measured not by decisions made in moments of pressure, but by the consistency with which they are upheld once attention fades. The resolution did not arrive with a dramatic announcement or a moment of public reckoning, but with a gradual settling, the kind that only becomes visible in hindsight, because the most lasting consequences are rarely loud when they take hold. In the months that followed the board's decision to restructure, the HOA began to resemble something quieter, smaller in posture, and more deliberate in action. An organization learning, sometimes uncomfortably, that legitimacy cannot be reclaimed through insistence alone. Policies were rewritten with clearer language, not to expand reach but to define limits. And while those changes did not erase the memory of what had happened, they created a framework that reduced the likelihood of repetition. Residents noticed the difference not because enforcement disappeared entirely, but because it became predictable, grounded, and less performative. The lake returned to its role as it had always been, a presence rather than a promise, its access respected according to records rather than flyers, its shoreline free from assumptions masquerading as entitlement. What lingered, however, was the collective memory of how easily authority had once overreached and how quietly it had been corrected, a memory that reshaped behavior even when no one spoke of it directly. Meetings, when they occurred, were shorter and more focused, attendance modest but intentional, with discussions centered on maintenance rather than ambition. The absence of grand plans was not mourned as a loss, but accepted as a recalibration, a recognition that governance functions best when it supports rather than directs. Financial transparency improved, not because it was demanded loudly, but because it had become necessary to maintain relevance, and the budget, once stretched thin by attempts to assert control, began to stabilize under narrower priorities. Residents engaged selectively, choosing involvement based on interest rather than obligation, a shift that reflected a broader cultural change within the community. Trust did not return all at once, nor did it need to, because the expectation of blind trust had been replaced by something more durable: verification. People checked, asked, and documented, not out of hostility but habit, having learned that clarity is a shared responsibility rather than a gift bestowed by authority. I remained largely absent from these developments, not because my stake had diminished, but because it no longer required defense. The permits sat unchanged in their files, the surveys remained as they always had, and the lake's outflow system continued to operate according to schedule, its purpose fulfilled without drama. Occasionally, someone would reference the festival in passing, usually as an example of what not to assume, and those references carried no bitterness, only a quiet understanding that the episode had marked a turning point. The HOA, for its part, stopped circling the lake entirely, as if acknowledging that the space was better left governed by records than by ambition. New board members joined with a different tone, less interested in expansion and more cautious about precedent, shaped by the institutional memory of what happens when lines are crossed without consent. The community adapted to this new normal, finding equilibrium not through consensus, but through respect for boundaries that had always existed but were now finally recognized. The water, rising and falling with seasons rather than agendas, became an unintentional symbol of that balance, a reminder that some systems function best when left to operate as designed. As time passed, the urgency that had fueled the conflict faded, replaced by routine, and with routine came perspective. What had once felt like a battle revealed itself as a correction, not an act of defiance but an alignment, a moment when process reasserted itself over performance. The HOA did not disappear, nor did it fully redeem itself in the eyes of every resident, but it settled into a role that matched its authority rather than exceeded it, and that adjustment, though humbling, allowed it to continue without constant friction. The community, having experienced the consequences of unchecked assumption, carried forward a quieter vigilance, less reactive but more informed, aware that governance is most effective when it is constrained by clarity rather than empowered by silence. The lake continued to reflect the sky, indifferent to meetings and minutes, its surface calm not because it had been defended, but because it had never needed to be. In the end, nothing had been seized, nothing reclaimed through force, and nothing proven through argument alone. What remained was a shared understanding that boundaries matter, that process outlasts pressure, and that authority, when it forgets its limits, will eventually be reminded, sometimes not by confrontation, but by the simple, lawful act of letting reality do the work.